Some people mistake protection for power. They never realize that true power begins the moment someone decides another person's fear ends today. Naomi Carter's breath caught as the cold October wind swept across the stone driveway outside the Moretti estate, carrying crimson maple leaves over the polished black pavement. Her fingers tightened around the worn canvas grocery bag she had picked up during her afternoon break, the paper receipt fluttering against the milk carton inside. She had worked for Adrian Moretti for exactly 93 days, long enough to memorize the rhythm of the mansion, but not nearly long enough to believe she belonged there. Every morning she arrived before sunrise, quietly polished marble floors worth more than every apartment she had ever rented combined, brewed coffee for staff meetings she would never attend, and disappeared into the background before the owner returned from whatever business occupied the most powerful man in the city. Invisible. That was how she survived. Invisible meant safe. Invisible meant nobody asked questions about the faded scar near her wrist or why she startled whenever a car slowed beside the sidewalk. Invisible meant tomorrow still existed. She adjusted the sleeve of her dark sweater, making certain it covered every reminder of a life she refused to revisit. The mansion gates began to close behind her as she stepped onto the private walkway leading toward the employee entrance. The security cameras silently followed every movement. Somewhere inside the house, cooks prepared dinner while gardeners packed away their equipment before sunset. Everything looked ordinary. Then a silver pickup truck rolled to a stop beside the curb. Naomi froze. The engine shut off. For one impossible second, she prayed it was a delivery driver with the wrong address. The driver's door opened. Marcus Reed stepped onto the pavement wearing the same leather jacket she remembered from a lifetime she had tried to erase. His smile hadn't changed. Neither had the heavy confidence in his stride. He looked at her as though no time had passed at all. "There you are," he called, almost cheerfully. "I've been looking everywhere." Naomi felt every sound around her disappear. The rustling leaves, the distant fountain. Even the birds seemed to vanish beneath the pounding of her own heartbeat. She took one careful step backward without answering. Marcus stopped only a few feet away, keeping his voice low enough that it almost sounded friendly. "You really thought you could disappear forever?" he asked. "I just want to talk." She knew those words. Once, they had always come before promises. Later, they came before apologies. Eventually, they became the sentence she feared most. She wrapped both hands around the grocery bag, forcing herself to breathe slowly. "Please leave," she whispered. Marcus laughed softly, shaking his head as if she had told an amusing joke. "You left without saying goodbye. You owe me one conversation." Naomi glanced toward the mansion entrance. Two security officers stood beyond the gates, too far away to hear. She wanted to call for help, yet the old instinct held her silent. For years she had trained herself to avoid making scenes, to shrink problems instead of confronting them. Marcus noticed the hesitation immediately. "See," he said, "you still know me." Another step backward brought Naomi against the cold iron gate. There was nowhere else to go. Marcus extended one hand toward her, not forcefully, almost casually, as though expecting everything to return to the way it had once been. "Come home," he said. "Let's stop pretending." Before Naomi could answer, the quiet hum of powerful engines echoed through the driveway. 3 black SUVs entered the estate in perfect formation, sunlight reflecting across polished paint like moving shadows. Every security guard instantly straightened. The convoy stopped only yards away. One driver stepped out first, then another. Finally, the rear passenger door opened. Adrian Moretti emerged wearing a charcoal overcoat over a perfectly tailored navy suit, his expression calm, unreadable, his pale blue eyes taking in every detail before anyone else seemed to notice it. He had spent years building an empire by observing what others overlooked. His gaze settled on Naomi first, then on the stranger standing far too close beside her. The air itself seemed to grow still. Marcus turned with an irritated sigh, unaware of the name that carried more influence in New York boardrooms and whispered conversations than almost anyone alive. "This is private," Marcus began confidently. Adrian never looked at him. Instead, he took one measured step toward Naomi, noticing the trembling grocery bag, the fear she fought so desperately to hide, and the single tear she refused to let fall. Only then did he speak, his voice quiet enough that nobody needed silence to hear every word. "She's my wife now." Marcus Reed stared at Adrian Moretti for several long seconds before a confused smile spread across his face. He searched Naomi's expression, expecting her to deny the impossible claim, but she could not find a single word. Her mind had stopped working the moment those 5 words echoed across the driveway. Adrian did not repeat himself. He simply stepped forward until he stood beside Naomi instead of across from her. It was a small movement, almost unnoticeable, yet it quietly changed everything. The distance that Marcus believed he controlled disappeared. Naomi no longer looked like a frightened employee standing alone outside an estate. She looked protected. Marcus laughed awkwardly, trying to recover his confidence. I do not know what game this is, but she has known me for years. Adrian finally shifted his attention toward him. His expression remained perfectly calm, the same composed face that negotiated billion-dollar contracts without raising his voice. You are standing on private property, he said evenly. You have one opportunity to leave respectfully. The security officers, who had remained motionless until then, immediately began walking toward the entrance without needing another instruction. Marcus noticed them, and his smile faded. He looked back at Naomi one last time. This conversation is not over. Naomi lowered her eyes without answering. Marcus hesitated for another heartbeat before returning to his truck. The engine started, and within seconds the vehicle disappeared beyond the tree-lined road. Only after the sound faded into the distance did Naomi realize she had been holding her breath. Her fingers loosened around the grocery bag, and the carton of milk nearly slipped onto the driveway before Adrian quietly caught it with one hand. He handed it back without a single comment. Thank you, sir, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Adrian studied her face for a brief moment. Fear still lingered behind her eyes, but there was something else as well. Embarrassment, as though she believed she had somehow created a problem for everyone around her. Walk with me, he said. Together they crossed the courtyard toward the mansion. The evening sun painted long golden shadows across the marble steps, while the fountain continued its steady rhythm, as if nothing unusual had happened. Inside the estate, employees respectfully stepped aside as Adrian entered, yet no one dared ask questions. Naomi kept her head lowered, expecting him to demand an explanation the moment they reached his office. Instead, he handed his overcoat to the butler and turned toward the grand staircase. Have dinner before your shift tomorrow, he said calmly. You skipped lunch again. Naomi looked up in surprise. She had. She simply had not imagined anyone noticed. Adrian continued walking without waiting for an answer. From the balcony above, he paused for only a second and glanced back toward the entrance where Marcus had stood only minutes earlier. Something about the encounter did not fit. Men like Marcus rarely appeared by coincidence. They appeared because they believed they had found an opening. Adrian Moretti had built his entire life recognizing threats before they reached the people under his protection. And for the first time since Naomi Carter arrived at his estate 93 days earlier, he decided she was no longer simply another employee working quietly behind closed doors. Naomi barely slept that night. The small staff room tucked behind the east wing had always felt modest but peaceful, with its narrow bed, wooden dresser, and single window overlooking the gardens. For the first time since she had moved into the estate, however, every passing car beyond the gates sounded too familiar. She sat on the edge of the bed long after midnight, staring at the warm lamp glowing beside her, wondering why Adrian Moretti had spoken those impossible words. He owed her nothing. She was simply one employee among dozens who kept the enormous estate running without recognition. Men like him protected businesses, investments, and family legacies. They did not step into the personal troubles of a housemaid they barely knew. Yet somehow he had. The following morning began exactly as every other morning had. Naomi ironed fresh linen in the laundry room before sunrise, organized breakfast trays for the kitchen staff, and quietly polished the grand staircase before the household awakened. She tried convincing herself that yesterday had changed nothing. Then she noticed 2 unfamiliar security officers positioned near the employee entrance instead of the front gate. Neither spoke to her. They simply nodded politely each time she walked past. During lunch preparations, Sophia, the head housekeeper, handed Naomi a new access badge. Mr. Moretti requested this for you, she explained. Naomi frowned. The silver badge carried a higher security clearance than the standard employee pass. There must be some mistake, Naomi replied. Sophia shook her head. There is no mistake. He personally approved it this morning. Naomi accepted the badge with trembling fingers, unable to understand why someone as powerful as Adrian would concern himself with something so small. Upstairs, inside his private office overlooking the Hudson River, Adrian stood silently beside the floor-to-ceiling windows while his chief of security placed a thin file across the mahogany desk. There were only a few pages inside. Employment history, previous addresses, public records. Nothing illegal, nothing remarkable, except one pattern. Naomi Carter had moved 4 times in less than 3 years. Every apartment lease ended unexpectedly. Every job change happened within months. Every move placed greater distance between her and one particular name. Marcus Reed. Adrian closed the folder slowly. Has she ever requested help? He asked. Never, the security chief answered. Has she filed complaints? No, sir. Adrian looked toward the gardens below where employees moved quietly, between flower beds and stone pathways. Naomi crossed the courtyard carrying fresh towels toward the guest house, completely unaware she was being observed. She walked with the careful habit of someone who never wanted attention. Yet Adrian noticed details that no report could explain. She always checked reflections in nearby windows before entering a building. She instinctively stepped aside whenever unfamiliar men approached. She never wore short sleeves, even on unusually warm afternoons. None of those habits appeared by accident. They were learned through experience. Adrian had spent most of his adult life reading people before they spoke. Fear left patterns more reliable than fingerprints. By late afternoon, another report arrived. Marcus Reed had been seen asking questions about the estate in nearby neighborhoods. Adrian placed the paper beside the untouched cup of espresso on his desk. His expression remained calm, but his decision had already been made. Whatever burden Naomi had carried alone for years had reached his front gate, and from that moment forward, it had become his concern as well. 3 days passed without another sign of Marcus Reed, but the silence did not bring Naomi peace. It only made her wonder when it would end. She buried herself in work from dawn until evening, polishing silver, arranging fresh flowers in the guest suites, and carefully folding pressed linens that smelled faintly of lavender. The mansion remained as elegant as ever, filled with polished wood, soft piano music drifting from hidden speakers, and employees moving with quiet efficiency. Yet beneath that calm surface, something had changed. Every entrance was monitored more closely. Security vehicles made more frequent rounds around the estate. Naomi noticed the changes, but no one explained them. She assumed they were unrelated to her. She wanted to believe that. Late Friday afternoon, Sophia asked Naomi to deliver freshly prepared tea to Adrian's private library before an evening business meeting. Naomi hesitated for only a moment before balancing the silver tray carefully in both hands. She rarely entered the private wing. The room was lined with towering walnut bookshelves, warm amber lamps, and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the river. Adrian stood near the fireplace reading a document while 2 executives quietly reviewed financial reports nearby. Without interrupting the meeting, Naomi placed the tray on the side table and turned to leave. Miss Carter. Adrian's calm voice stopped her. She turned immediately. Yes, sir. He walked toward her carrying a cream-colored envelope. I believe this belongs to you. Naomi accepted it with confusion. Her name was written across the front in unfamiliar handwriting. The moment she recognized the writing, the color disappeared from her face. Marcus. She did not need to open it to know who had sent it. Her fingers instinctively tightened around the envelope as though hiding it would somehow make it disappear. Adrian noticed every change in her expression. Would you like a few minutes? He asked quietly. Naomi forced herself to smile. I am fine. It was a polite answer. It was also completely untrue. She excused herself and walked into the hallway before carefully opening the envelope. Inside rested only a single folded note. There were no threats, no angry words, only one simple sentence written in neat handwriting. You cannot hide forever. Naomi closed her eyes. The hallway suddenly felt much smaller than before. She folded the paper again and slipped it back into the envelope, hoping no one had seen her reaction. But Adrian had followed only a few steps behind, not to invade her privacy, but because experience had taught him that people rarely admitted when they were frightened. He stopped several feet away, giving her enough space to choose honesty if she wanted it. Did he send that? he asked gently. Naomi remained silent for several seconds before giving the smallest nod. He keeps finding me, she whispered. No matter where I go. Adrian studied the envelope before looking back at her. Has he contacted you since the day outside the gate? Another quiet nod. Letters. Unknown phone numbers. Flowers delivered to places where I worked before. Her voice trembled despite every effort to remain composed. He always says he just wants to talk. Adrian did not interrupt. He simply listened. Sometimes listening revealed more than questioning ever could. Naomi looked toward the window where the evening sky reflected across the river in shades of gold and blue. I spent years trying to become invisible, she said softly. I thought if I stayed quiet enough, eventually he would stop looking. Adrian's expression never changed, but one truth settled firmly in his mind. This was not a problem that would disappear with time. Marcus Reed believed persistence would eventually wear down fear. Adrian Moretti intended to prove that. This time, Marcus had chosen the wrong door to knock on. The following Monday arrived wrapped in gray clouds and steady rain that blurred the city skyline beyond the estate. Naomi welcomed the weather because fewer visitors came when the roads were slick and quiet days allowed her thoughts to settle. She spent the morning arranging fresh white lilies throughout the mansion, their clean fragrance filling rooms that had witnessed generations of quiet conversations and carefully guarded secrets. Just after noon, Adrian asked his executive assistant to clear the schedule for 15 minutes. That single request surprised everyone who worked around him. Time was the one thing Adrian never wasted. When Naomi was invited into the library, she immediately assumed she had made a mistake. She stood near the doorway with her hands folded neatly in front of her apron, waiting for instructions. Adrian closed the folder on his desk and motioned toward the chair across from him. Please sit. Naomi hesitated before taking the seat. The room remained silent for several seconds. There were no accusations, no formal questions, only the soft sound of rain tapping against the tall windows. Adrian finally spoke. You have been trying to solve this alone for a long time. Naomi lowered her eyes. I did not want my problems to become someone else's burden. Adrian nodded once, as though he had expected that answer. Sometimes people who carry the heaviest burdens believe asking for help makes them weak. Naomi offered a faint smile that never reached her eyes. Sometimes it feels easier to disappear. Adrian looked at her steadily. You should never have to disappear simply to feel safe. Those words settled over the room with unexpected warmth. Naomi could not remember the last time someone had spoken about her future instead of her past. Adrian reached into a drawer and placed a simple document on the desk between them. It was only one page. Naomi glanced at it without understanding. This is a temporary personal security agreement, Adrian explained. Beginning today, you will have transportation arranged whenever you leave the estate. Your schedule will remain confidential, and no visitor will be allowed access to you without approval. Naomi looked up immediately. Sir, that is far too much. No, Adrian replied calmly. It is what should have happened the moment I realized someone believed they could follow you without consequence. Naomi's eyes filled with emotion she struggled to hide. No one had ever reorganized an entire security plan because of her. She had spent years believing she was insignificant, someone expected to quietly adapt to whatever life placed in front of her. Adrian continued speaking with the same measured tone. There is one more matter. He paused only briefly. The statement I made outside the gate has already begun circulating through certain circles. People are asking questions. Naomi's heartbeat quickened. I am sorry if I caused trouble. Adrian almost smiled. You did not cause it. He folded his hands together. Sometimes perception creates protection long before paperwork ever can. Naomi searched his face, slowly realizing what he meant. You are saying? Adrian finished the thought for her. As long as people believe there is a personal connection between us, many will think twice before involving you in their own plans. The room became perfectly still. It was an unusual proposal, built not on romance or obligation but on quiet strategy. Naomi looked toward the rain outside before returning her gaze to Adrian. She saw no arrogance in his expression, no expectation that she owed him anything in return. Only calm determination. For the first time in years, someone had offered protection without asking her to surrender her dignity. And although neither of them realized it yet, that single conversation would quietly change the direction of both their lives. Over the next 2 weeks, the estate settled into a new rhythm that almost nobody questioned aloud. Naomi continued performing every responsibility she had accepted on her first day, yet small details quietly shifted around her. A black sedan waited whenever she needed to leave the property. Her work schedule was adjusted so she never walked to the employee entrance alone after sunset. The new security badge opened doors that had previously remained locked to household staff, allowing her to move through protected corridors whenever she finished late. No announcements were made. No explanations were offered. Everything happened so naturally that visitors assumed it had always been that way. Naomi often wondered how one man could rearrange an entire system without making anyone feel inconvenienced. Adrian never mentioned it again. Instead, he returned to his demanding routine of board meetings, charitable foundations, and endless business calls that stretched from early morning until well after dark. Yet despite the distance he carefully maintained, his attention appeared in the smallest moments. One rainy afternoon, she discovered a new umbrella waiting beside the employee entrance after hers had broken during the previous storm. No note accompanied it. Another morning, when she skipped breakfast because she had overslept after a restless night, the kitchen manager quietly handed her a warm container of oatmeal and fresh fruit. Mr. Moretti requested that no one working a double shift should begin the day hungry, he explained with a smile. Naomi thanked him, although she suspected the instruction had been meant for only one employee. Little by little, the constant weight pressing against her chest began to loosen. She no longer checked every passing vehicle with the same panic. She slept through entire nights without waking at every unfamiliar sound. One evening, after finishing preparations for a formal charity dinner, she stepped into the rear garden where hundreds of tiny white lights reflected across the fountain. The autumn air carried the scent of cedar and fresh roses, and for the first time in years, she stood completely still without wondering who might be watching. "You seem different," came a calm voice from behind her. Naomi turned to find Adrian standing several feet away, his suit jacket draped over one arm after a long day of meetings. "I hope that is a good thing," she answered softly. Adrian looked toward the fountain instead of directly at her. "You are looking at the gardens instead of the gates." Naomi had not even realized she was doing that. A faint smile appeared across her face. "I suppose I am." They stood together in comfortable silence as the water rippled beneath the evening lights. There was nothing awkward about the quiet. Neither felt the need to fill it with unnecessary conversation. After a moment, Adrian spoke again. "Peace often returns slowly. Most people expect it to arrive all at once." Naomi nodded thoughtfully. "I had forgotten what ordinary felt like." Adrian glanced toward her, and for the first time she noticed something beyond his composed confidence. Beneath the reputation, the influence, and the carefully controlled public image was a man who understood loneliness better than most people ever would. Before either of them could say another word, one of the security officers approached respectfully with a sealed envelope. "Sir," he said quietly, "this arrived at the front gate a few minutes ago. There was no return address." Adrian accepted it without changing expression. He opened the envelope, unfolded the single sheet inside, and read only one sentence before his eyes hardened almost imperceptibly. He looked toward Naomi, then folded the paper in half and slipped it into his coat pocket. Whatever had been written there, he had already decided she would not face it alone. The next morning, Adrian called his chief of security into the conference room before sunrise. The handwritten note remained on the polished oak table between them. It contained no direct threat, no offensive language, only a single sentence that carried enough meaning to concern a man who had spent decades recognizing dangerous intentions before they became actions. It read, "You cannot protect her forever." Adrian slid the paper across the table. "Increase the perimeter around the estate," he said calmly. "Quietly. No unnecessary attention. I do not want the staff alarmed." The chief nodded immediately. Should Miss Carter be informed? Adrian considered the question for a brief moment before shaking his head. Not yet. Fear grows when people imagine dangers they cannot see. Let her have one more ordinary day. Outside, the estate awakened beneath a crisp blue sky. Naomi spent the morning preparing guest rooms for a charity gala scheduled later that week. Fresh flowers filled crystal vases throughout the mansion, and sunlight poured through tall windows, warming the marble floors she had polished countless times before. She smiled more often now, exchanging quiet conversations with the kitchen staff, and even laughing softly when one of the gardeners joked about the stubborn squirrels stealing flower bulbs. It was a small sound, but several employees noticed it. They had never heard Naomi laugh before. Adrian noticed as well. Passing through the central hallway after a morning meeting, he caught sight of her helping an elderly florist carry 2 heavy boxes toward the ballroom. Without hesitation, she took the larger one despite being half the florist's size. She never looked around to see whether anyone was watching. Kindness, Adrian thought, was most genuine when it expected no audience. That afternoon, Naomi received permission to leave the estate for 2 hours to visit a neighborhood bookstore she had loved years before. A security vehicle followed at a respectful distance, remaining far enough away that she would not feel observed. She wandered quietly through shelves lined with worn novels, history books, and poetry collections, eventually purchasing a small hardcover edition of Maya Angelou's essays. As she stepped outside carrying the paper bag, she noticed a familiar silver pickup truck parked across the street. Her heartbeat immediately quickened. The truck remained motionless. She could not see who sat inside because sunlight reflected across the windshield. Instead of panicking, she remembered Adrian's words about never facing fear alone. Rather than walking toward the bus stop as she once would have, she calmly returned inside the bookstore and informed the security officer waiting near the entrance. Within moments, the black sedan arrived. By the time they reached the curb, the silver truck had already disappeared into afternoon traffic. Naomi stared through the window during the drive back to the estate, surprised by her own reaction. Weeks earlier, she would have blamed herself, convinced she had somehow invited trouble simply by existing. Now she had chosen something different. She had trusted someone. When Adrian learned what had happened, he did not criticize her for leaving the estate or ask why she had visited the bookstore. Instead, he simply said, "You made the right decision." Naomi looked at him with quiet uncertainty. "I still became afraid." Adrian offered the faintest smile. Courage is not the absence of fear. It is choosing wisdom while fear is present. Those words stayed with Naomi long after the conversation ended. Neither of them realized that the greatest change taking place was no longer around the estate with its cameras, gates, and security teams. It was happening inside a woman who was slowly learning that living without constant fear was not a dream beyond her reach, but a future she was finally beginning to believe belonged to her. The annual charity gala transformed the Moretti estate into a sea of soft candlelight, polished crystal, and quiet conversation. Business leaders, judges, philanthropists, and community organizers filled the grand ballroom, their voices blending with the gentle sound of a string quartet performing near the marble staircase. Naomi moved gracefully between tables, making certain every guest felt welcome without ever drawing attention to herself. For years, she had believed disappearing was the safest way to live. Tonight, for the first time, she did not feel invisible. She felt respected. Across the room, Adrian greeted donors with his usual calm confidence. Yet his attention drifted toward Naomi more often than anyone realized. Not because he doubted her ability, but because experience had taught him that moments of celebration sometimes invited unexpected interruptions. As the evening progressed, one of the security officers quietly approached Adrian and handed him a small tablet displaying live camera feeds from the estate entrance. Adrian glanced at the screen. A familiar silver pickup truck had stopped beyond the front gate. It remained outside the property, parked legally along the street, its driver making no attempt to enter. Adrian handed the tablet back without changing expression. "Maintain observation," he said quietly. "No confrontation unless necessary." Inside the ballroom, the music continued uninterrupted. Naomi was arranging fresh coffee near the dessert table when one of the newer employees hurried toward her. "Miss Carter," the young woman whispered nervously. "There is someone outside asking if you will come speak with him for just a minute. He says he only wants to apologize." Naomi did not even need to ask who it was. Her hands became still, but only for a moment. Then she remembered the conversation outside the bookstore, Adrian's quiet confidence, and the promise she had silently made to herself. She would never face fear alone again. "Thank you for telling me," she replied gently. "Please let security know I will not be meeting anyone outside." The young employee nodded and hurried away. Naomi remained exactly where she was. She did not hide. She did not run. She simply continued pouring coffee for waiting guests with steady hands. Several minutes later, Adrian joined her near the serving table. "I heard what happened," he said softly. Naomi looked toward the ballroom doors before answering. "I almost wanted to go outside just to end all of this." Adrian shook his head. People who refuse to respect boundaries are rarely satisfied by one more conversation. Naomi took a slow breath. "I know." She surprised herself by smiling. "That is why I stayed here." Adrian returned the smile, subtle but genuine. "You trusted your own judgment." Before Naomi could respond, the head of security approached. "Sir, the vehicle has left the area." Adrian nodded once. "Thank you." No dramatic confrontation followed. No raised voices echoed through the estate. The evening continued with speeches celebrating education scholarships and neighborhood food programs, while guests applauded volunteers who had quietly changed countless lives. Standing near the back of the ballroom, Naomi watched ordinary people receive recognition for acts of kindness that would never appear in headlines. Suddenly, she understood something that had taken years to learn. Strength was not measured by who frightened others. It was measured by who helped others feel safe. Adrian glanced across the room and found Naomi no longer watching the doors or the windows. Instead, she was listening to a high school student describe dreams of becoming a teacher after receiving a scholarship from the foundation. In that quiet moment, Adrian realized the greatest victory had never been keeping fear outside the gates. It had been helping hope find its way back inside one human heart. The first snow of December settled quietly across the Moretti estate, covering the gardens in a blanket of white that softened every path and every stone wall. The fountain that had echoed through autumn now rested beneath a thin layer of ice, while warm lights spilled from the mansion windows into the peaceful evening. Nearly 3 months had passed since the charity gala. No more anonymous letters arrived. No unfamiliar vehicles lingered outside the gates. After the repeated attempts to contact Naomi were carefully documented by Adrian's legal team and reviewed by the proper authorities, Marcus Reed received a formal court order prohibiting further contact. It was not revenge. It was accountability established through the law. For the first time in many years, Naomi could walk through an ordinary day without wondering whether fear would be waiting around the next corner. She had begun taking weekend classes at a local community college, something she had postponed for years because she never believed life would stay stable long enough to make plans. She laughed more easily now. She called her younger sister every Sunday afternoon without pretending everything was fine. She even started leaving fresh flowers in the employee dining room simply because she thought everyone deserved a beautiful place to share a meal. One quiet Saturday morning, Naomi carried a tray with 2 cups of coffee onto the glass terrace overlooking the snow-covered gardens. Adrian stood near the railing, watching the sunrise paint the Hudson River with pale shades of gold. He accepted the cup with a grateful nod. Neither hurried to speak. Their friendship had been built on comfortable silence long before either recognized what it had become. After several peaceful moments, Adrian reached into the pocket of his overcoat and placed a small velvet box on the table between them. Naomi looked at it in surprise before slowly meeting his eyes. "Months ago," Adrian said gently, "I spoke words neither of us expected to hear. At the time, they were meant to protect someone who deserved peace." He paused, choosing every word with the same care that had guided every decision since the day they met. "Today, I would like to ask something entirely different." He opened the box, revealing a simple platinum ring that reflected the morning light without unnecessary extravagance. "Naomi Carter, would you consider building a life with me? Not because either of us needs protection anymore, but because every ordinary day has become better since you walked into it." Tears gathered in Naomi's eyes, yet this time they carried no fear, only gratitude. She smiled through them, the kind of smile that reached every corner of her face. "Yes," she whispered, "I would." Adrian slipped the ring onto her finger with quiet hands, and for a long moment neither said another word. The world around them remained wonderfully ordinary. Snow drifted gently through the air. A gardener waved from across the courtyard. The kitchen staff laughed somewhere inside the house as breakfast was prepared. Life continued without grand speeches or dramatic celebrations. It simply moved forward with hope. Naomi looked across the estate that had once been only a workplace and had slowly become a home. She finally understood that dignity could never be given by wealth, titles, or influence. It was restored when someone chose to see another person's worth before seeing their circumstances. Adrian had offered protection when she needed safety, respect when she expected pity, and freedom when fear had convinced her freedom no longer existed. And on that quiet winter morning, beneath a sky as clear as a new beginning, everyone who truly knew their story would have agreed on one simple truth. The greatest act of strength was never controlling another life. It was creating a place where another person could finally live without fear. And that day, the world remembered what dignity looks like.